Did you know that the English language today is actually less than 10% real English? Ever wondered how the English language got to how it is today? One of the answers lies within the Romance languages: Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and French. All of these languages have the same root, Latin. Long ago, Latin was a widely spoken language that eventually evolved into different languages as people moved to different lands. Along with Latin evolving into multiple languages, it also influenced and changed pre-existing languages. The language that we are currently using to speak English is heavily influenced by Latin and has lots of Latin roots and words. Latin has two major methods of influencing Old and Middle English, eventually forming today's version of English: Christianity and the Renaissance. The spread of Christianity brought Latin vocabulary and characters to English. The Renaissance's artistic and educational revival influenced English through literature.
Latin first influenced English through the spread of Christianity. Before the late 6th century AD, Anglo-Saxons were pagans. They lived in Britain, spoke Old English, and wrote using a runic alphabet with angular characters. In 597 AD, St. Augustine and his 40 missionaries brought Christianity to the Anglo-Saxons from Rome. With Christianity came a Latin vocabulary and a Roman alphabet. Many Latin words were added to the Old English vocabulary. These words mostly had to do with the church, but words with domestic meanings were also brought over. Anglo-Saxons replaced the runic alphabet with the Roman one because Roman characters were easier to read and better suited for writing on parchment. The Roman alphabet had characters for most English sounds. However, a few letters were incorporated into their writing to record sounds Latin didn't have, such as thorn, win, and yog. Latin's influence on English also kick-started English literature. In the 600s, being literate usually meant you could read Latin. Most of the great English writers and scholars lived after Latin was introduced. Later, in the 1400s, another milestone for English writing occurred. The invention of the printing press allowed more books to be published and helped standardize English writing. More books were being published in English rather than in Latin, including an English Bible. Although we now have English translations of the Bible, Latin's influence on English can still be seen in many church-related words used today.
Examples of Latin influence on Old English are seen in a variety of modern English words. Latin influenced our vocabulary only, not our grammar. This is due to the fact that Latin was not brought into Old English by people migrating. Instead, scholars converted ancient texts from Latin to Old English. Because of this, they simply replaced Latin words with equivalent Old English words, or borrowed Latin words if they felt there wasn't an appropriate Old English equivalent. Therefore, Latin had a huge impact on vocabulary, but not the grammar. Christianity was one of the two major ways Latin vocabulary was incorporated into our modern-day language. Examples of how Christianity helped influence Old English and modern-day English is seen in religious and educational words. During the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons in England up to their Christianization, many words that were borrowed from Latin were academic and religious. The borrowed words were mainly religious and academic because scholars were translating religious and academic texts. This is largely because the books that scholars were reading and receiving were educational books and Christian books. For example, a modern English word that we use today which derived from Latin is the word Bible. The word Bible is from Middle English, which comes from the Latin word biblia, which comes from the Semitic word biblos, which means papyrus or scroll. One reason this change happened was because of the great vowel shift in the 1400s. The E sound in biblia and biblos became a long I sound to form the vowel sounding of Bible. This was a result of vowel sounds being made higher up in the mouth. Another change was the weakening of consonants. The lia suffix sound in Latin weakened to become the l sound.
The Renaissance period greatly affected the English language in terms of how Latin influenced it. In a way, the French indirectly spreaded it through the Norman conquest. The Renaissance translates to the revival, that is, the revival of Roman and Greek culture. It was born in Italy, the heartland of pre-Christian Roman Empire. Both the Romans and the Greeks focused on the human aspect of education, thus the term humanist movement came to be. Not only did the Renaissance focus on the arts, it gave spotlight to human patterns of thought and human behavior, such as secularism, humanism, individualism, and skepticism. These ideas promoted the curiosity and individual thinking of citizens without the hindrance of societal standards, thus allowing many great innovations, creations, and discoveries. Speaking of innovations, the printing press was invented around this time, which spread information quickly and accurately across a vast amount of land. The literacy rate increased as more and more people had access to various reading materials. New schools were also set up with curriculums that are more secular than what the church provided, as they taught subjects like math, science, and literature. They also taught students how to think, write, and speak critically and clearly. After you know a little bit about the Renaissance, here are the ways how the Renaissance and its aspects incorporated Latin to the English we know today. Revived towns and trade routes made the Northern Europe exposure to the Italian Renaissance quite easy. Approximately 10,000 to 12,000 words were derived from Latin and Greek and was added into the lexicon. When the Latin texts are translated into English, scholarly, scientific, and law terms just stayed the way they were. You probably heard of legal terms like habeas corpus or subpoena. Educated people at the time studied Latin because it was a universal scholarly language. Another example, organisms around us each have scientific Latin names that classify them into each species. For example, a goat's universal scientific name would be Capra agaricus urcus. A lot of organisms have long names like this because of the taxonomy system, but today you wouldn't call a goat Capra agaricus urcus, it was just too inconvenient. And over time, common names are made in place of these long names. As Northern Europe became more and more exposed to the Renaissance, they also came in contact with the Latin literature. This is very important because in written Latin, people strive to preserve an authentic form of the language like the grammar and the mechanics of it. People try to learn and replicate it. But on the other side, spoken language changes all the time as pronunciations evolve, new words become invented, and much more other things. This does not mean that Latin didn't evolve whatsoever. It was just slower compared to other languages.
As said previously in the video, one part of the words added during the Renaissance had to do with education. People consciously wanted to add more words from Latin. Words are both taken fully from the Latin language and by words in the middle. One example of a word like this is transmit, to cause something to pass on from one place or person to another. The word comes from two Latin words, trans meaning across, and mitto meaning descend. A word that came from Latin during the time, but was anglicized was horrid, meaning very unpleasant or disagreeable. The word came from horridus, bristly, and was soon shortened to sound more like English. An example of a word that came from the Latin language wholesale is atrium, a central hall or court in a modern building with rooms or galleries opening off it, often glass covered. The Latin word also means atrium. While we have given you a few examples of anglicized and wholesale words from the Renaissance, there are many more. Approximately 29% of the English language comes from Latin. A great percent of those words came from the Renaissance. English is a much different language because both the Renaissance and because of Christianity. Latin at the time was used mostly in academia and in the Christian religion. When scholars began to use more Latin words in a language, and people started to accept the use of them, the words were modified and straight up accepted. Lucky for the people, the language got more exoteric with the use of easier words, and people ceased to realize that Latin had any influence on the language. The language, however, in the future will change, and Latin roots may become a thing of the past. Languages always change.